Martin Luther, a man who once admired, called for the extermination of Jewish leaders. It's in the record, folk. It's something my teachers in my Christian school went to never told me, and they possibly knew it. I mean, you find this everywhere you go. Charles Wesley could not get along very well with women. And when he finally married in his 50s, he married the worst woman that a man could ask for. And he couldn't live with her. He never divorced her, but he had to move out from her. He had to, just really, really worst mistake of his life. I mean, this might have been something he couldn't help. I don't know. But the point I'm making is every human who has ever lived has had some serious flaw. And if you want to judge a man or a woman by their flaws, every one of us is bad, horribly bad. I mean, if you meet and sound some of the people who have known me, some of them, they could tell you all kinds of stuff about me, and some of it might actually be true. Some of it wouldn't be. But sometimes the people who judge you harshly are themselves on the wrong side of the issue. And you cannot get along with everybody. But you will go crazy if you try. Again, point I want to make, yes, George Washington, by today's standards, was a racist, and he built one of the greatest countries that ever was. But by the 2019 standards, he was a racist, not to mention a slave owner. Abe Lincoln saved the Union that Washington built, but by 2019 standards, he was not called out by the people of his day, understand, but by 2019 standards, he was a racist. All right, I'll leave that topic for a while. Now, a lot of women began to ask for the right to vote. Elizabeth Cady Stanton, among others, and they were hoping the 15th Amendment would give them a right. I'm not going to mention too much about that now, because there'll be more said about it later. The women kept campaigning and campaigning, and in 1919, the 19th Amendment gave them the right, and in 1920, the women voted legal the first time. Now, I say that tongue-in-cheek because the state of Wyoming had given their women the right to vote long before then. Wyoming was first, before the 19th Amendment passed, and then Arizona was second. So this was to come about slowly and gradually, but the country was not quite ready for it in the 1860s and 1870s. Now, into the South came a lot of Northerners. No, the Scalawags did not come from the north. The carpetbaggers got their name because many of them were so poor that they attached all their belongings into a little carpet bag, which they tied up at the top. And then they would carry this carpet bag on a stick, and a picture of a typical carpetbagger is going around on a stick, and a cartoon showed the carpetbagger reaching into the back pocket of a wounded Confederate soldier, pulling what little money he had out of his pocket. The carpetbaggers came over because they could legally hold office. They're the type of people who had little chance of getting an office in the north, but they figured they could come south where a lot of your southern people could not vote or hold office. They could control southern politics. So they came south, and the southern people hated them. Eventually the Ku Klux Klan attacked them also, and forced them to either leave or be quiet or lie low. Now the Scalawags, they were southern people who had not taken up arms against the Union, and you might can guess they were hated also, very much so. The southern people were left spending a lot of time hating each other, fighting each other. All right. Again, for those of you following on, I'm looking at page 414. Yeah, the Ku Klux Klan was made up of a lot of Confederate war veterans at first. As they died off, they were replaced by other people. When the blacks were ruling the South, I mean, they never did have a complete rule, but while they were in control of a lot of the South and holding office, but when the black people were holding office in the South, they tried to get free public education in the South. And you might think, wasn't this noble? Well, yes, But there was one problem: the Southern people simply could not afford it, or they felt like they could not afford to build the schools, pay the teachers. So eventually, the Southern reforms were done away with. The reforms of the Southern blacks were done away with. But the blacks did try to get free public school in the South like you had up north and get the Southern people educated, white and black alike. It did not work, at least not at this time. Now, later it did. But as recently as 1919, a great Southern baseball player named Joe Jackson had to sign his name with an X, and somebody would witness the X. He signed his baseball contracts with an X. Couldn't even write his own name. And he's called Shoeless Joe Jackson because one day he bought himself a pair of baseball spikes, played a game in them, and made a blister his feet badly. The next day he showed his manager the blisters and said, may I be excused? The manager said, okay, but then the manager said, oh, wait a minute, we don't have enough players. Jackson, you got to take the field. Jackson put on his spikes and couldn't stand it, so he quickly pulled off his spikes and ran out in the field in his sock feet and played the entire game in his sock feet. And for the next, that's been more than 100 years ago, to this day he's still called Shoeless Joe Jackson. Even though he actually had a whole closet full of shoes, he hated the name, but he played one game in his sock feet. And we never forgot about it. All right, anyway. The South was to lag behind for many generations in education, and in a lot of cases it still is. It's only been about 10 years ago or less that Georgia ranked number 50 of the 50 states in education. And having been a school teacher in Georgia once, I'm not surprised. Nothing against any of you, understand, but I am against the way the public schools are being run. All right. What do I see as a solution? Go back to the 1- and 2-room schoolhouse where everybody knows everybody and nobody is lost in the crowd. If you don't like what I'm saying, I mean, speak up, but I think that's a solution to a lot of education issues. Go back to the small school. These big schools, far too many students don't feel like getting up to it. They start rebelling and acting out to try to get attention. All right. Shortly after Johnson was impeached, in fact, while Johnson was being impeached, while the trial against Johnson was going on, the Republican Party met, and they chose a very popular man, very popular, to run for president, a man named Ulysses Grant. Hopefully all of you have heard of him before. I talked about him last time. Grant was the Union's #1 general in the Civil War. He was eventually promoted above all generals. Generally, generals do not make good presidents. For many years afterward, Ulysses Grant was looked on as being the worst president the country ever had. Then came Harding, and Grant and Harding. Now, I want to say this, though, about both Grant and Harding, and even Nixon to a lesser extent. Nixon now goes down as the worst in a lot of circles. A period of time after a big war is followed by a period of low public morality. This was true after the Civil War. Public morality went low. After World War I, public morality went low, and that's when Harding was president, after World War I. And again, about low morality means you have scandal after scandal after scandal. I'm talking money scandals mostly, where that people take bribes who shouldn't, government officials take kickbacks, and where the government official would award a businessman a contract, and in turn that businessman will give this official a kickback. Things that aren't supposed to happen, but do. But Grant's presidency was troubled. He was marked by one scandal after, even though Grant himself was an honest man. Here was the problem Grant had. He did not know how to judge character. So he would appoint men into government positions hoping that he could trust them, and they in turn would betray the trust he placed in them. Harry Truman said this about, he was a bad administrator who surrounded himself with men who were worse administrators. Another problem that Grant had, that a lot of presidents have had, if Grant would have quit after one term, he'd go down in history probably as an average so-so president. Most presidents who have been re-elected, and Grant was, most of them have had a turbulent time in their second term of office. Thomas Jefferson did, George Washington did. James Monroe didn't, but James Madison did. Andrew Jackson did. Abraham Lincoln was shot dead at his term, second term. So was William McKinley. Nixon had a terrible time after he was reelected. Most of your presidents have had a very bad time after having been reelected. In fact, the man who followed Grant, Mr. Hayes, Rutherford B. Hayes, said that a president should only serve one term. And after he'd served his term, he would not allow himself to be nominated again. He said, I won't serve. So anyway, Grant served 2 terms as president. His administration was marked by scandals. Now, one of the more, you might say one of the more humorous scandals, so it's not humorous at the time, though, it's called the salary grab. You may or may not know that members of Congress set their salary. Congress sets the president, so members of Congress can vote their own salary. Well, for the first time in history, the members of Congress got together and decided to vote themselves a pay raise, but not just a pay raise starting out, because it was the end of the term, but to collect all the back pay that would apply to the last 2 years, the whole 2-year term that since they had been elected the last time. In other words, they were going to collect their present pay and their back pay also. They voted for it. It went to the president, and President Grant, nice man that he was in a lot of ways, signed it. It's called a salary grab. But one of the politicians who did that wound up paying for it pretty heavily by being voted out of office. But a lot of politicians from that day to this are really hesitant to vote for themselves a pay raise because it can become a campaign issue. My opponent, while he was in office, he voted himself a 6% pay raise. Can you do that? Well, the politicians have done this, even though these men are entitled to being paid, but they get to vote themselves for how much they collect. But again, today, when politicians raise their own pay, for the most part, it's kept quiet, except during campaign time when their opponent is going to bring it up. Anyway, the vice president under Grant was found to have accepted bribes. He should have been impeached and removed from office, but he wasn't. But this was Republican rule, and it was marked by scandal after scandal. Credit Mobilier, your book mentions that. I won't write it down, but there's another scandal called Credit Mobilier, salary grab. One scandal after another. Eventually, though, the northern people began to get tired of trying to make the South behave, you might say, and they finally just simply gave up and said, let the South be itself, let the Klan take over, we just don't care, we spent too much time fighting the South anyway. The Northern Resolve ended, and the Reconstruction is looked on as being a revolution but half accomplished. By half accomplished, it meant the revolution that freed the slaves, but once freed, they were made second-class citizens. A revolution that did make the South, let them know they could not leave the Union. Nevertheless, the South became its own had its own identity and abode by its own laws and did things its own way and was looked on as being separate. Now, that does not apply to 2019. There is no South anymore. Everywhere you go, you'll find the same kind of restaurants, the same kind of highways, and a lot of the same stuff. But when I first came to the South was a lot different than it is today. In a lot of ways. Have any of you ever heard of a man called the Goat Man? There used to be a man who'd roam around in Alabama and Georgia and Mississippi carrying about 200 or 300 goats that were not caged or fenced in. These goats would follow him around. I saw him one time. When I first came south and heard about it, didn't know if I could leave or not. He finally went to a rest home and got too old, and his goats all got sold off. But this was the old South, folk. The old South. Today, none of that goes on, as far as I know, at least. But the old South, New South, white supremacy wound up becoming the order of the day in the South. Your book has an interesting sentence there on page 422. In Georgia, our own state here, Blacks made up 40% of the population but only paid 2% of the taxes. Basically what this means is that most of the black people were very, very poor. The Democrats, to keep the blacks in line, turned to terrorism. Lynchings. Lynching is murder for racial reasons, and it was to go on in the South for several generations. And a lot of Southern politicians did not dare move against it, particularly President Roosevelt, a Democrat, got his votes from the Democrats, and he did not want to offend Southern white voters, because without them he could not become president. So what did he do? He let the lynchings go on. I mean, this is a political fact, folks. Have any of you, I asked this in the other class, have any of you ever heard of Emmett Till? Okay, about 3 of you. Yeah, okay, 3 of you. For those of you who don't know, Emmett Till was from Chicago, and like a lot of Chicago, he had relatives in Mississippi, because a lot of Mississippians moved north. So Emmett Till decided one day to visit his cousins down in Mississippi. He was warned, you can't do like you do in Chicago. Well, one day Emmett Till whistled at a married white woman. He was killed for this act. The case was brought to trial. The guilty were acquitted, again by a Southern jury. The case went all the way up the chain to got the Attorney General. The Attorney General didn't want to handle it because it was such, so the Attorney General passed it on up to Dwight Eisenhower, the president at the time. Dwight Eisenhower said the federal government's not going to make a move against it. And then the persons who had killed Emmett Till got away with it. This is part of, this story was, I mean, the reason I mentioned this is this was a famous story that got out all over the world. In actual reality, this happened hundreds and hundreds of times over. Lynchings did a lot to keep the black people quiet, and for many generations, not much was done about it. From time to time, a lynching will make news as more facts are discovered. Of course, most of the people anymore who actually committed the crimes are long deceased. All right. Which brings us up to the election of 1876.
Yes, I think recently they were saying that the lady lied, that he was
Oh, I didn't hear that.
Oh, you didn't hear that?
I haven't heard that. That's news to me. That the lady lied?
Yeah, she admitted it.
Yeah.
Okay. That might be the case. I don't know. I've never heard that. Okay.
Because she's still living there. So.
Oh. It's been a long time. It was in the 1950s. I was 8 years old when he was killed. And that was when race tensions were getting a real big start in this country. All right. You know, if she's alive, she'd be in her 90s for now, I imagine.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, again, thanks for that info. I didn't know. Now, we come to the election of 1876. Now, most of you might be old enough to remember, in the year 2000, we had a disputed election, particularly for the state of Florida. Well, in 1876, we had a disputed election also. The southern states, a few southern states had 20 electoral votes. Nobody knew who had won. Did Hayes get them or did Tilden get them? Well, so when there was no majority, no clear majority, the election went to the House of Representatives. Now I'm going to make a long story short here. Rutherford B. Hayes promised to remove the last of the federal troops if the House would vote him in. Well, this promise he kept. I mean, it was a bargain made between the House of Representatives and Rutherford B. Hayes. The House voted him in as president. And his first act as president was to remove all federal troops from the South. This was the end of Reconstruction. Reconstruction, that was a symbol that Reconstruction had been given up on by the North. The North was going to go about their business and largely leave the South alone, and they did for the next almost 90 or so years. So Rutherford B. Hayes. Now, did the votes now in dispute rightfully belong to Hayes or Tilden? That is a question we cannot answer to this day. To prevent that from happening, a law was passed that only the returns bearing the governor's signature. But what happened was some southern states sent 2 sets of returns. One set showed Hayes the winner, another set showed Tilden the winner. Again, nobody knows to this day which side won. The Democrats charged that Hayes had stolen the election. Maybe he did, but the House of Representatives voted for Hayes on the basis that Hayes would remove the last of federal troops. And he became, now, as I've already mentioned, Hayes believed that a president should only serve 4 years. And one of the history books I've read, he said that the president should not be reelected, and he would not have himself elected. But one thing now about him, I will say, one of the history books I read said this: nothing earth-shaking happened while Hayes was president. That he had a nice, quiet, easy time of it. At the end of his 4 years, went out. One thing that did happen, though, Thomas Edison brought in a tape recorder, which he had just invented, and played it in front of Hayes and recorded Hayes' voice. Mr. Hayes is the first voice we have, first president's voice we have that was recorded on tape. Again, that happened during his administration. Other than that, the telephone was invented in 1876 while Hayes was being elected, but nobody paid much attention to it until later. All right, folk, we'll start on the next chapter.